The ocean. The most dangerous place on Earth. For the entirety of human history, the ocean has been a mysterious, dark, and frightening place. Such a hostile environment, completely unfit for human life, is scary on an innate level. But for many people, the fear of the ocean isn't necessarily rooted in survival, but mystery and curiosity. A fear of the unknown. With fears like Thalassophobia and submechanophobia being so mainstream and common, I wondered, where are all the oceanic horror movies? Oceanic horror is my favorite subgenre of horror. Cosmic horror is a close second, and in fact, cosmic and oceanic horror often overlap, with stories like The Abyss and the works of H.P. Lovecraft. But while cosmic horror revolves around space and the cosmos, so too does oceanic horror with the ocean. And the ocean is a much more familiar place. Most of you watching have been to the beach and swam in the tranquil, shallow waters of the ocean. For me at least, swimming in the shallows, while fun, always presents a strange, ever-present paranoia. Sure, you aren't likely to step on a crab, get bitten by a shark, or get sucked into a rip current, but the possibility is always there, because the ocean is completely unpredictable. And while you might try to keep a sharp eye out for any potential threats, you're in their domain, and they saw you before you saw them. Videos of divers being circled by a great white, or boaters nearly being crushed by an unexpected whale leaping out of the water, have always fascinated and terrified me, because they illustrate how completely incapable we are of knowing what could be right below our feet, looking up at us. When I was younger, I would visit my grandparents in Louisiana every summer. One year, my uncle took my brother and I on a boat into the channels of Lake Pontchartrain. He dropped the anchor, and my brother and I would swim freely. I remember climbing down the anchor line, probably 15 or 20 feet, to the very bottom of the channel. As I descended the chain, I remember thinking that anything could attack me from any angle, and I would have no way of knowing until it was too late. This fear that anything could be down there with me, watching me, while almost all of my senses were completely useless, was dreadful. The bottom of the channel is much colder than the surface, and the lake floor is a terrible, silty sludge that you can slip right into if you aren't careful. In fact, this very same silt that I was dipping my toes into swallowed passenger plane Eastern Airlines Flight 304 in February of 1964. Though some of the wreckage was recovered, the majority of the plane, as well as all of its 58 occupants, have never been found. It's assumed that the cold black sludge swallowed them whole. A harrowing thought. This idea that anything, whether it be a sunken passenger plane or a horrific monster, could be just out of view is what scares me the most about the ocean. And to think that over 90% of the ocean's life has not been discovered is truly the stuff of nightmares. Fictional horror in the ocean is by no means a new marriage, but it is one that hasn't been getting enough attention as of late. I know it's a niche genre, but I just can't shake this feeling that oceanic horror has been hung out to dry. The last full-blown oceanic horror movie that stood out to me was Underwater, and before that it was The Lighthouse. Maybe you could add Pacific Rim into that list, but it's obviously more of an action movie. Other than those, what good oceanic horror movies have we gotten recently? Even in the last 2 decades. Now that we're really getting into the topic of this video, let me try to define some of my personal criteria for oceanic horror. If you're enjoying the video so far and want to help fund more in the future, consider donating over on my Patreon. You could also buy me a coffee because I'm addicted to caffeine. If you're not able to, no worries. Subscribing to my channel and liking this video is more than enough. Let's get back to it. So like I said, this is my personal criteria for oceanic horror. presented to you with a neatly organized, bulleted list. The first one is fairly obvious. The work of fiction has to be set in the ocean or around it, with much of it taking place in water. The threat has to come from the ocean and use it to its advantage in one way or another. Water has to be almost as dangerous as the main threat itself. This one in particular I always love to see. Water in general is just so difficult for us as humans to do really anything in. You can't breathe, you can't see, you can barely move. It just creates such a strong sense of desperation, like trying to run from something in a nightmare. I mean, if you guys have ever been in the water and felt a presence that you wanted to run or get away from, you know that feeling. The next one is a technological disability. This one is a staple in oceanic horror. The boat is too small. The sea lab has no power. Water pressure is crushing our suits. It's not essential, but in my opinion, it easily adds several layers of fear on top of the main monster threat. Underwater handled this really well, and in my opinion, the dangers of the slightest crack in your helmet were a lot scarier than any of the monsters. The final bullet point is more of a personal tangent, but the threat has to be something more interesting than just a big shark. Look, I've loved sharks for my entire life, but unfortunately they're just played out. We've seen big sharks, we've seen fast sharks, we've seen sharktopuses, three-headed sharks, demon sharks, and I'm sick of it. I mean, sharks can be scary, especially the ones in deep blue sea for me, but just do something different. Do a giant squid, a leviathan, ghost pirates, fishmen, a manatee. Call it Manatee-Eater. I mean, you could also just do Cthulhu, maybe the most popular sci-fi ocean monster ever. All I'm saying is there's a lot of options out there, and the only thing that's required is a little bit of creativity. Okay, so now that we've laid some groundwork for what I like about oceanic horror, I ask you, why don't we get more movies from this genre? Well, aside from it simply being niche, water is also just generally difficult to capture in film, and there are a few different ways of going about it. You can film in real water, whether this be the ocean or a pool set. I personally love how this looks because, well, it's the real deal, but it's also probably the most difficult option. Of course, modern technology has made filming in the ocean easier, but coordinating large film crews around something as unpredictable as Mother Nature has its challenges. The infamous filming of The Abyss, which was filmed in a power plant that had been filled completely with water, nearly killed Ed Harris and James Cameron on separate occasions because of equipment malfunctions while underwater.
And I was hanging there, out of breath, no air, and I'm going, oh, this is great, you know. Then one of the guys swims over, another guy, and he gives me his regulator. I'm just about to burst, to take in a lung full of water, and he gives me his regulator, and he gives it to me upside down. So I get like half air and half water. And for a split second, I really thought I was a goner, and then Al came swimming over, the cameraman, ripped the fucking thing out of whoever the guy was and put his regulator in the right way. I just broke down, man. I was just weeping because I really thought I was gonna die for a second, and it also pissed me off that I was afraid of that.
The filming also included periods of the cast and crew being submerged for hours at a time, power outages, and difficulty keeping the water clean. I really recommend watching the documentary Under Pressure about the making of The Abyss. That said, The Abyss is kind of an exception rather than a rule. Most movies will just use a studio set with water elements, which is still difficult but not as dangerous as filming in the ocean or what The Abyss did. Rather than real water, a director could also opt for CG water, which there have been some mixed results. Avatar: The Way of Water has some of the most insanely realistic CG water I've ever seen. It's probably the best ever. If you haven't seen it, well, I can't blame you. But also check out a clip or two. Opposite that, you have something like Aquaman. One thing about Aquaman that always stood out to me in particular was the disgusting underwater hair effects. Hair doesn't have to be CG if you're doing an underwater scene though. There's actually a pretty cool technique that I've seen some movies use. Basically, you blow air towards the actor to simulate water flowing through their hair and along their clothes. I think it looks pretty good. I'm a fan. Along with some other effects like fog and precise lighting, you can achieve a somewhat decent underwater scene with simple tweaks in post. This is known as dry for wet. Dry actors, then edited into a CG liquid environment. This is probably going to be the most common way to go about filming an underwater scene because it's safer for the crew and allows for more customization in post. Unfortunately, can also yield a wide range of mixed results depending on the director, the aesthetics of the film, and I'm sure a bunch of other aspects. CG water has been getting a lot better in recent years, especially with the innovations James Cameron made for Avatar, but even if you have the money, water effects are generally difficult and take a lot of time. Avatar: The Way of Water was in production for years and years because Cameron wouldn't settle for ugly CG. It's no secret that CG artists are being pushed to their limits and forced to hammer out project after project, reshoot after reshoot, producing shitty CG as a result of how little time they're given. The reason CG seemed to peak nearly 20 years ago with films like Dead Man's Chest is because those artists were given time to develop the effects and create oceans that were realistic. We need to return to that and stop drowning our CG artists in a sea of never-ending content. So oceanic horror movies might have some technical difficulties that make them a little bit more involved, but I'm not convinced it's enough to shy away filmmakers and studios. I'm gonna be honest, I think the entertainment industry as a whole has just been lacking creativity. Brave words, I know. Many studios seem to continually opt for safe, formulaic films that don't push the boundaries too far, cheaply relying on callbacks and nostalgia, rather than telling meaningful and genuine stories. Why try something new and exciting when we could have another sequel or remake? And that's not to say that if you judged any of these movies independently that they're bad, but they don't exist in a vacuum. Basically every subgenre has been shoved out of the way unless there's a pre-existing IP that belongs to it. With how fast content is produced these days, I just don't see why we can't get a healthy amount of everything. So many movies are made every year, but a lot of them are indiscernible. Few even seem to try something interesting. I recently rewatched Underwater in preparation for this video, and to be honest, I thought it wasn't gonna hold up. I watched it for the first time while at the beach, which kind of makes me predisposed to enjoy it, but I really liked it the second time. If you haven't seen it, it's about a deep-sea mining station in the Mariana Trench that strikes something big and causes the station to begin falling apart under its own weight. It had its flaws like any movie does, but for me, delivered on everything I wanted it to. Scary monsters, cool props and set design, and the ocean. It's undeniable that Underwater is extremely derivative of other movies like Alien, but I think it had enough of its own ideas to be its own thing and stand apart. Unfortunately, this movie seems to have faded away and been mostly forgotten, so if you haven't seen it, give it a watch, and make up your own mind. Google says the budget for Underwater was between 50 and 80 million, the perfect budget for this kind of movie. Sadly, it only made about half of its budget back in the box office, which probably signaled to studios that movies like this are more of a risk than a reward. Streaming has killed the movie theater. There's no doubt about that. With only the biggest blockbusters surviving the sheer disinterest of modern man, how does a weird mid-budget film survive? Well, I think the last year or two has actually restored a lot of my hope. I was pretty cynical during the late 2010s and early 2020s, but a few golden nuggets have been released that actually give me hope. I'm talking about Godzilla Minus One. I've been a huge Godzilla fan since I was young. Some eagle-eyed viewers might have noticed. You bet your ass, I wasn't missing my first Japanese Godzilla film in theaters, and man did it look good. That first trailer in particular was fueling my hype train. See, I thought I'd be one of only a few though. Sure, Godzilla's pretty mainstream, but would he survive the American goldfish's attention span? Turns out, yeah, he survived with flying colors. Godzilla Minus One absolutely crushed in the box office, passing 100 million worldwide, a major achievement for Japan and smaller movies as a whole. That's nearly 7 times the film's budget of 15 million. You heard me right, 15 million. Disney has no excuse when a $250 million movie looks like this, and Minus One looks like this. Minus One made me a proud fan, and guess what? it had some pretty damn good oceanic horror. Was this a sign that mid, even low-budget films can survive the modern wave of streaming? Alongside -1 were a few other quality low to medium budget films that gave me hope. I know -1 had a leg up because it's part of the longest running film franchise in history, but I think it proved that if your film has a solid narrative and is able to shock and excite people, budget doesn't matter, and the audience will give you their attention. We need more movies like -1. This leans back into a philosophical debate, but if studios learn to prioritize creativity and meaning over any potential financial gain, I think we'll start to see a lot more of every subgenre. If any of you are interested in oceanic horror but don't know where to start, I'll put some of my favorite movies and games on screen now. And of course, I'll be pinning any other suggestions I see in the comments. As always, I hope the rest of your day or night is good. Farewell, everyone.